I will take you back to Antwerp, to a place I love dearly, which is the workshop of Peter Paul Rubens. And I will discuss some of the artist's practices by way of a single painting, namely the Madonna Enthroned, adored by saints, and more on the picture in a second. Now, the reason for choosing this work is that it presently figures in Studio Rubens, a large-scale research and conservation project taking place at the museum, in which two monumental altarpieces will be subsequently conserved and investigated in the museum galleries. You can see the visitors really love it. Treatment of the Madonna Enthroned is presently rounding up, and in the process we've had the occasion to not only closely look at the altarpiece itself, but also the many related works. And this large altarpiece and the works in its orbit make for an interesting lens through which to consider Rubens's workshop practices, I hope to show. Still, I stress at the outset that Rubens's production was extremely versatile. He produced works in many different genres, many different scales, many different media. Moreover, most of production likely evolved over the course of his long career and travels. This means that the strategies, which I will discuss today, are possibilities of workshop practices, not rigid procedures always followed. And this is certainly not so in works of different types. Another reason for focusing on a large altarpiece is that this category of works was an important one for Rubens. The artist famously wrote that he was, quote, better fit to execute very large works than small curiosities. Sometime later, the Rubens fan and biographer Roger de Pille wrote, and I quote, never before was there a painter who painted such large works in such plenitude as Rubens. Royal palaces and churches bear testimony to this, end quote. These images illustrate the kinds of works de Pille may have had in mind. The Medici cycle in the Louvre, comprised of 24 large-scale pictures, and at the right, the descent of the cross altarpiece in Antwerp Cathedral, towering over 4 meters high. Altarpieces were instrumental in securing Rubens's reputation. He returned to Antwerp, his native city, during a truce in the 80 Years' War, which had left many of the church decorations in ruins. And this meant that there were opportunities for artists to create works. Rubens had vision and ambition, as well as powerful ties and funds through his family. And through the combinations of these elements, he established himself as the go-to painter for monumental altarpieces north of the Alps. A quick word of introduction on the commission of the Madonna Enthroned. Rubens completed this mammoth altarpiece, the largest in our galleries, measuring 4 by 5.5 meters, in 1628, and he was at that point at the height of his career. It was made to adorn the high altar of the Augustinian church, and it was valued at a spectacular sum of 3,000 guilders. The Augustinian order had something to make up for. In the 16th century, the Augustinians were banished from Antwerp for their Lutheran sympathies. Some of the friars were even imprisoned at the time. In 1608, they petitioned for permission to come to Antwerp anew, and they pledged eternal loyalty to Rome and Madrid in the process. They would build a convent and a church, which is here pictured at right, and they also promised to continue to contribute to educating Antwerp's children. In fact, Rubens' son Albert went to school with the Augustinians. The church's first stone was laid in 1615 and it was consecrated in 1618. It was dedicated to the Virgin Mary and all of the saints, which explains the choice of subject for the high altar. What begs clarification still, however, is how Rubens reduced all of the saints to the 14 in his altarpiece. The saints which we can see with him are no pre-existing ensemble like the 14 helpers. It has been suggested by Koen Bulckens that the saints, that maybe relics of the depicted saints were kept in the church. Max Roses has suggested that maybe they were the saints of brotherhoods who were active in the Augustinian church. But there is no solid evidence in support of this claim. And so this is a puzzle which remains to be solved. Previous version of the presentation. So to give a short overview of the issues which I will address today, I will start by opening with some of the difficulties in naming Rubens's collaborators, the vast majority of which are unknown to us. I will then move on to discuss Rubens's use of preparatory studies, the many drawings and sketches which he used to give shape to his composition, demonstrating that in these works too, Rubens involved the help of assistants. Next up are the practicalities of executing the fruit of the studies in the large. And I have already made clear with Rubens, large means large. This entailed painting collaboratively, but also creating and using a specific infrastructure catered to the production of these monumental pieces. In conclusion, I will involve a copy after the composition to highlight how the artist produced derivatives of his work and the substantial effort and collaboration which went into these. And these are bits and pieces, facets and aspects of Rubens's practice, but together I hope they will nonetheless bring a bit to life this fascinating place. And also, as Greta said, it helps that we are here together with different people discussing different workshops. These shops were busy places geared at producing works manually, and if they had strategies to do so more efficiently or to reach a better result, they would use them. And so I think it helps to look at different examples. Okay, so I seem to have forwarded a previous version of my slides, but I will continue with the last version of my lecture. So this says invention, but I will now speak on Rubens's collaborators and the difficulty of naming them. So I will, over the course of my presentation, point out several instances of collaboration. Now, who was specifically responsible for the input I will discuss, I do not know. I cannot recognize in these collaborations the hand of any of the 4 collaborators we know by name for the period in which the altarpiece was painted. And these are Justus van Egmond and Willem Paneels, who registered as masters with the Antwerp Guild in 1628, exceptionally adding that they were, quote-unquote, with Rubens at the time. Of Jan Cossiers, we know that his parents wouldn't let him accompany Rubens on his diplomatic travels to Madrid, implying that Cossiers was the master's assistant at the time. And then lastly, the engraver Paulus Pontius lived with Rubens from 1624 until 1631 and received room and board. None of these men, as far as we can see, contributed to the commission, but this needn't surprise us. Only 20-something of Rubens's workshop collaborators are solidly documented over the course of the artist's entire career. We should remember that these names were not found in guild ledgers, and the ledgers of the Guild of St. Luke are the go-to source for studying apprentices with Antwerp artists. Now, when Rubens was appointed court painter to the archdukes in Brussels in 1609, a privilege exempted him from guild regulations. The known collaborators, so the names we do have, were derived from early modern biographies and chance finds in different kinds of archival materials. The documented collaborators are likely only but a small share of the total. Using the workshops of Gerrit Honthorst and Frans Floris as references, I have elsewhere conjectured that Rubens had at least 25 assistants in his shop at any given time and would have had gone through more than 120 in total. The names we know are moreover an elite selection. The known collaborators all became masters and started shops themselves. And a great few of them, moreover, landed prestigious gigs as court painters all over Europe. We should keep in mind, however, that only a minority of artists underwent the model trajectory of apprentice, journeyman or assistant, and later master. A broader statistic analysis of Antwerp Guild records has established that only a fifth of apprentices later became masters. Now, the remaining 80% likely continued to work as journeymen in other shops. Like Rembrandt, about whom we will hear more from David, Rubens attracted collaborators who were advanced, likely having gone through 1 or 2 apprenticeships elsewhere. A minority, the elite selection we know, continued to become masters. The larger body of unknown collaborators, I believe, may have included journeymen staying on in the shop as wage workers. This gap in our knowledge will prevent us from ever pinning names on every Rubens product. Still, the fact that different hands were involved in a commission is relevant, especially so when we encounter them in places where we don't suspect them, such as preparatory studies. And now I move into these. Rubens's composition is an artistic tour de force, containing no fewer than 18 figures, plus some sheep, putti, and all are in dynamic poses, as if we got them mid-motion. The effect of spontaneity and virtuosity, however, was the result of a laborious preparatory process. And we know this because many of the studies have been preserved. I show you here a first scribble or crabbling or primo pensiero in the Metropolitan, compositional drawing in Stockholm, first modello in Frankfurt, and a second modello in Berlin. Moreover, and this is quite exceptional, for Rubens there were also detailed studies in oil of the figures of Sebastian and George, 2, which were made in the process of the Frankfurt sketch. So it was really figuring out the pose of these 2 guys. And then there is a study for the head of Apollonia, who you can see here. And it may have been the case that Rubens made this, especially before working out the figure in the large, but he would have hung on to studies like this in a stock, and he might reuse them in different compositions. There were many changes in between the different studies, and this way we can really see how ideas grow and evolve. And now what I found particularly intriguing were those relating to the crozier or curl of the bishop's staff, of Augustine's staff, who is in the foreground. Now the opening of the curl was facing to the right in Stockholm. It was painted first to the right, but then corrected to the left in the Frankfurt sketch. It was painted first to the left, but then corrected to the right in the Berlin sketch. And it was painted first to the right, but then corrected to the left in the large altarpiece. The whole resembles something of a visual stutter. And it begs the question, what happened here? Now, I found the answer. Now, the crozier is based on the shape of a shepherd's staff, who used the curl to rake in straying sheep. Tapping into the biblical metaphors of spiritual leaders as herdsmen of the faithful, it's tapping into this symbolism. Now, in line with this symbolism, the Ceremoniale Episcoporum posited that the crozier must face away from the bishop and towards the faithful. In this particular setting, however, it meant the curl could not face Augustine, but it could also not face the Christ child in front of him. It was decidedly not in need of spiritual guidance. After several attempts, therefore, the opening of the crozier was directed towards the congregants in the Antwerp Augustinian church. Such changes may have been arrived at through discussions with a patron, but this is, I think, not the case for another intriguing series of alterations, the tweaks to the figures of George and Sebastian. In the many preparatory studies, we see how the pose was altered step by step. A hip twist, an arm goes out, goes in again, a head is turned ever so slightly. Having labored the position of the two figures extensively in this group of works, Rubens then decided to swap them positions, but mind you, he kept the pose for George as an inspiration for Sebastian. And this was not the end of it yet. When later a copy was produced on a small scale, Rubens altered the position of the arms again. These alterations appear minor, but the many attempts testify to their importance to their makers. They are perhaps best understood through the lens of concepts in humanist art theory, specifically variety, composition, and grace. In today's context, it is also worth considering who was responsible for making the sketches. In his biography of Rubens, Joachim Sandrart wrote that, quote, Rubens always made the invention of the works by way of a model 2 or 3 palms high, after which his disciples, like Van Dyck, Jordaens, Van den Hoeke, and others, began to paint the composition on the large canvas, after which Rubens would go over or paint the most important parts himself. Now, this author has some authority, as he spoke with Rubens in the year before the Madonna Enthroned was painted. However, in recent years, several scholars, among them my dear colleague Nico van Hout, have questioned whether all preparatory studies are really autograph, whether we must uphold, let's say, this rule of thumb. And I think this is also the case here. Several works in the group are atypical to what we have come to expect from Rubens's preparatory studies, like the sketches for Sebastian and George. Rubens often made studies for individual figures, but these are typically done in chalk on paper. For groups of 2 or more figures, the go-to medium was pen and ink on paper. Conversely, oils were in the preparatory process, typically reserved for modelli and head studies. The technique of these works, therefore, stands out. The Amsterdam sketch at left is decidedly the most problematic of the two. Now, one part was added by a later hand. You can see this blob of paint here, which appears to conceal, or tries to conceal, not very successfully, that a piece of panel was added to this side. But the original paint layer has problems too. You can see Sebastian's bundle of arrows is somewhat formless. The pole which George is holding goes nowhere, and his head, though Rubensian in its features, displays clear hesitances in the execution. Moreover, he is missing a piece of armor at the knee, and you can see this very clearly here, but also in all other renderings of the armor. And so it should have a clip here. Now, taken together, these issues raise serious concerns about Rubens's authorship and about that of Van Dyck, which has been floated in the literature earlier. Still, I'm inclined to say that the Amsterdam sketch was done in the workshop, and I'm hesitant to let it go as an original preparatory study for the Madonna altar. My reason for thinking so is that the sketch tries a variation of pose which fits the series as a whole, taking up elements from different workshop materials. So you can see from the Stockholm drawing, it takes the loincloth and the position of Sebastian. From the Caen and Frankfurt sketches, it takes the gaze of George. I think that Sebastian's extended hand, which was painted in the Frankfurt Modello, was an element first tried out in the Amsterdam sketch. And so I think that Rubens likely enlisted the help of an assistant in working out this pose, though he may have given him some instructions. There we had this part. Okay. Whereas collaboration is somewhat of a surprise in Rubens's preparatory studies, we should take it for granted in the execution of his large works, especially the monumental ones. Even a fan like De Pil commented on the uneven quality of executions in the artist's oeuvre. Some pictures left the shop without Rubens having barely touched them. That said, there are exceptions. The Adoration of the Magi in our museum is also a large work, be it somewhat smaller than the Madonna Enthroned, of which a long critical tradition has it that Rubens painted it all by himself. The famed Rubens scholar Michael Jaffe had claimed the same for the picture under discussion here today, so for the Madonna Enthroned, which in this comment was the occasion for a recent meeting of Rubens's experts in the museum galleries. Now, having diligently combed through the works over the course of an entire day, the expert agreed that some studio input could be discerned, advancing this juxtaposition as an example. Okay, this is then, I'll go back to this. Okay, I don't know if it's clear, so we see two lamps, one painted by Rubens, the other presumably by a collaborator. I'll leave it up to you to figure out which is which is which. The uneven lamps, it must be said, are somewhat of an exception when considering the whole. Overall, the work is exquisitely painted, these details show. I show you John the Baptist, a close-up of George and Sebastian. Mind you, the screen is somewhat, it shows somewhat more red than what I see here. I'm inclined, following the majority of the experts, to attribute much of what we can see, the final layers of paint, that is, to Rubens himself. We should keep, however, in mind a suggestion by Sandret and others that collaborators may have been tasked by laying out the first stages of the composition, but this is now concealed by subsequent layers of paint. In this specific work, then, Rubens was very much involved, to such an extent that, somewhat paradoxically, workshop participation emanates more clearly from the preparatory studies than it does from the finished work. And here I must warn you, I'm going to be a bit lost. I do not know where we're going. Okay. Good. What? Okay, one other part that I had here, and I had for you already a beautiful slide with a reconstruction drawing of Rubens's workshop as a space, the building, which still survives today in Antwerp as a museum, Rubens House, and which some of you will have visited. And the point I meant to make with this is that, the collaboration and study are intriguing, but I feel we shouldn't limit our study of workshop practices exclusively to it. Another issue meriting historical attention in the case of Rubens is the scale, because painting on a large scale can be very tricky. We learn this from a letter of Jacob Jordaens, which he wrote as he was working on the triumph of Frederick Henry. Canvas for the Oranjezaal in Huis ten Bosch with the phenomenal measurements of 7.5 by 7.5 meters. Must be one of the largest pictures produced in Antwerp in the 17th century. Now, the canvas was so large, the artist testified, that he could not span it out in his workshop in its entirety, forcing him to paint it piece by piece. The most difficult thing of all, Jordaens wrote, is that he had to work from the concept in his head rather than from sight. Now, and purely artistic concerns weren't the end of it. Jordaens also fell from a ladder while painting the work, leaving him immobilized and in fear of gangrene for a month. There were workarounds to a small studio space. One could work in situ, such as go in the church for which the altar was to serve, or rent an ad hoc space. However, this required moving people and materials around, as well as expenses and other possible troubles, as Rubens himself experienced in 1634. The artist at that point directed a band of his colleagues to execute the triumphal arches for the joyous entry of the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand. These were constructions of wood and canvas, some of which could tower up to 20 meters high, and they were created in large spaces, especially rented for the occasion. The refectory of the convent of the Calced Carmelites and the galleries of the Old Bourse. However, the convent soon complained because painters and carpenters stayed up late, made too much noise, and hogged the stove. It was more practical, and so imagine here a reconstruction of Rubens's workshop, to have a workshop catered to making large pictures, which is exactly what Rubens had. And soon after his return from Antwerp, he bought a 16th century house on a large plot of land, and next to it he built an Italianate wing, which had housed a large workshop with an exceptional height of 6 meters. In fact, purpose-built workshops were a rarity. Most artists in the city, they rented a house and they worked in one of the vacant rooms in the house of which they lived, meaning that the ceilings would be substantially lower. And so Rubens, by contrast, could paint large at home. And this infrastructure gave him an edge over his colleagues, which he used to his advantage. In the first 6 years, after moving into this large workshop, he painted 2 monumental altarpieces per year. And by monumental, I mean over 4.5 meters high. And at the same time, none of his colleagues painted so large. So space too is, I feel, an element of workshop practice, though often disregarded. It structures the activities of the collaborators within it. When a commission was finished, Rubens often produced derivatives for the markets, which could be paintings or prints. There exist many small copies after the Madonna Enthroned, but this one, at present in the Prado, is particularly important because it figured in Rubens' estate as a piece like the altarpiece in the choir of St. Augustine's Church, made by the late Sir Peter Rubens. I'm inclined to link it to a workshop assistant of the 1630s. At this time, Rubens employed several artists, among them Victor Wolfwood and Frans Wouters, specialized in painting small-scale versions of large compositions. And so these are small canvases with many tiny figures in them. However, I can again not positively link the work to a known name. Bert Schepers, the Wolfwood specialist, have told me that it is not Wolfwood, so we can cross him off the list, but who it may be not a clue. The 1630s was, moreover, also a period in which Rubens reworked several of his earlier compositions. The Prado copy has had an intriguing genesis. In most respects, it follows the large altarpiece. But in some particular details, it appears to go back to the Berlin Modello. And this kind of puzzled us as we were working on it. What happened? However, and one such detail is shown here. We see Willem of Aquitaine, who's standing before the throne with the Madonna. In the Berlin Modello, you can see very clearly he raises his hand with the martyr's palm high. Then, as you may see a little bit, it was also painted like this in the large altarpiece. However, Rubens corrected it by placing the hand lower. And then the Prado copy, painted later, shows, it appears, the version of the hand depicted in the Berlin Modello. Macro-XRF research by Louis Verkruijsen of the University of Antwerp has, however, made clear that the Prado copy started out as a faithful copy of the large altarpiece. And so, and I'm showing you one detail which is representative of the whole. In the macro XRF scan of the copper image, you can see that the low version of the martyr's palm was first painted in the Prado copy, after which it was overpainted going back to the Berlin Modello. So there was the altarpiece, a faithful copy, and then in a second stage, this was overpainted going back to an idea which had been phrased earlier. This procedure has substantial implications. It means that rather than copying the small-scale modello, which was decidedly the more convenient option, because the Prado copy and the Berlin modello are roughly the same size. So rather than copying the small modello, the copies instead copied the monumental altar, scaling down the composition substantially. Moreover, if I am correct in linking the Prado work to the small-scale painters of the 1630s, the painting would have been copied in the church, meaning that it was high up the altar and supposedly unevenly lit. It seems like a large hassle, however, and oh no, this is again gone. It seems like a large hassle, but I have encountered the procedure in several other works in which I am 100% certain that the painting was made in the early decades, in 1610s, and that the derivative product, in these two cases, prints, was made by sending out a workshop collaborator to the church, where the painting was, you have to imagine, very high up, and that this collaborator painstakingly copied the composition, returned it to Rubens, and in these other cases, of which and also beautiful images, I promise you, in my other presentation, Rubens then overworked the assistant's copy, making a variant of his earlier work. And so this was really the point I wish to make, something in which he invested substantial resources, time, effort. The arm of George II was copied from the altar as it was. And here again, you can see this is the altarpiece. This is a macro XRF scan of the Prado copy, showing that this version of the arm was first painted in the Prado copy, and it was then corrected to turn it back. And we had a recent study day about all of these works in Antwerp, and this I do wish to add or stress here. I think one of the phrases most used during that day is thanks to the macro XRF, thanks to the macro XRF. We've had, I think in the 60s, 70s, infrared reflectography revolutionized the field of early Netherlandish painting. I think now macro XRF allows us to see in these 17th century works, stages, painting stages that show us how complex or long a procedure could be. Now, so the arm of George II was copied from the altar as it was before being changed in the Prado copy. And I am tempted to conclude that it was Rubens himself who augmented this composition after a collaborator had delivered the faithful groundwork. And then Rubens decided to hang onto it, keeping it for his own collection as a souvenir of an artistic journey undertaken in his workshop. Thank you.